Aragorn, son of Arathorn, described by author J.R.R. Tolkien as pale, with keen grey eyes, looks a little different in a new card game from Wizards of the Coast. Since his reveal, Black Aragorn, as I'll be calling him, has generated much discussion, marking a certain inflection point in an ongoing conversation about race, media, art, and representation. In this video, I'll try and illustrate why I think Black Aragorn is, for lack of a better word, fucking stupid, by looking a little bit at how art is created, how and why fantasy resonates with us, and the value of artistic intent. I'll also try and pick apart some of the common talking points people make when arguing in favor of a Black Aragorn or race swaps in general. First, let's talk about motivation. To hear some people talk about it, every instance of a canonically white character getting suddenly diversified comes from a purely artistic motivation. Black Aragorn is just a vibe, really. Just a sort of creative happenstance, the same as when Tolkien first created him as white. Tolkien was just flipping a coin, really. Never mind that there's this broader, ongoing cultural fixation with race, or on so-called racial redress. Never mind about all these broader appeals towards representation, or how many other characters seem to have undergone similar transformations. Aragorn is black now. Well, just because. In pretending at a lack of motivation, the champions of Black Aragorn also pretend at being colorblind. What does it matter if he's black, they say? What does it matter to the plot? This argument, of course, only pertains to white characters who are race-swapped and not the other way around. Again, while fixating on race, gender, and sexuality in every other facet of life, not least of all art, the same people will then claim that Black Aragorn is somehow culturally inert, that he exists devoid of context. Let's think about it a moment. Would Lord of the Rings really remain unchanged if Aragorn were black? Elrond, for instance, already disapproves of the romance between his daughter Arwen and Aragorn. Isn't it then reasonable to assume that Aragorn being black might change that dynamic in some way, or change the way in which it's interpreted by the audience? Might we have the sort of Middle-earth equivalent of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Or is it that the elves as well are all a similarly cosmopolitan bunch? If that were the case, wouldn't that then, in some sense, undermine the idea of different races, elves, men, dwarves, all coming together for the greater good if, at the outset, they're all composed of the same diverse ethnic coalition? Would it be easier for a black elf to get along with a black dwarf? Is there prejudice, not just between elves and men and dwarfs, but also among themselves? Or is this hypothetical, all-inclusive Middle-earth supposed to be aspirational? Are we supposed to view a story that in many ways is explicitly about race through a colorblind lens? Here we have another example. While Aragorn is poised to take his rightful place as king, Denethor views Aragorn as a usurper, a mangy ranger without the proper grace or bearing to be king. Would we then infer a racial component in this as well if Aragorn were black? Wouldn't it mean something different? Wouldn't there be additional context if Aragorn was black and Denethor white? Wouldn't it mean something if a black guy became king of the White City? Some people, if you probe them enough, will eventually give up the game, that the whole thing really is about some sort of racial redress, about a cynical demographic bean counting. But then why lie at all then? Why is it that we always have to chip away at this facade of nonpartisanship to get at the obvious truth of why something is being done or advocated for? The main reason, I think, certainly in the case of Black Aragorn, is to try and disguise just how discordant this new, modern interpretation is from the character as he was originally intended. It's to try and mask a nervous and cynical attitude about art that flies in the face of Tolkien's rich and purposeful world building. If you wanted to be crude and reductive about it, Tolkien was basically a scholar of white people. He was a scholar of Norse and European literature and histories of peoples that were majority Caucasian in appearance. He conceived of Lord of the Rings as a fictional history of England, a country historically majority Caucasian in appearance. As an adult, Tolkien probably hardly went a day when he wasn't surrounded by a majority white populace. All that is to say that no, it more than likely wasn't just random happenstance that Aragorn would be interpreted as white, nor does it mean that there's anything racist about it. It's just reality. Unfortunately for some, it seems to be an inconvenient one. They are unable to reconcile the social and cultural cachet of Tolkien with the fact that he was a scholar of and based his writings on cultures that they would rather not be alluded to. Our modern racial bean counters would rather people not be reminded of themselves as Irish, English, Welsh, Scottish, Danish, etc. They would rather all that be nullified into simple, nebulous white, a labeling which dissuades any sort of historical or cultural identity that isn't automatically taboo. Returning to the subject of reality, let's tackle what is probably the most popular, but also the stupidest argument that people make when trying to persuade others of a Black Aragorn, or of a more diverse Middle-earth in general. The idea that it's just fantasy, bro. It's just fantasy. You can do whatever you want. Let me make it perfectly clear for the exceptionally stupid or the willfully disingenuous. I'm not against the idea of racial diversity in fantasy, or even in Middle-earth where it makes sense. I'm against this notion that art or fantasy or world building is just concocted at random, that it operates on simple childlike whimsy. It speaks to either a complete lack of understanding or else a complete disdain for the way art is made and for how worlds are created. It's an argument that, like most arguments put forth by today's cultural vandals, I doubt they themselves actually believe. In some deep lizard part of their brain, even if they won't admit it, they understand that the effectiveness of fantasy is predicated on the understanding of reality. But don't take my word for it. Here's what Tolkien himself had to say on the subject. Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of, scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know, or could not perceive truth, facts or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever got into that state, it would not seem at all impossible. Fantasy will perish and become morbid delusion. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. So upon logic was founded the nonsense that displays itself in the tales and rhymes of Lewis Carroll. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. In short, the reason why Tolkien's stories of wizards and elves continue to resonate is because he took such great pains to ground them in a coherent, believable world. The key word here is verisimilitude, the appearance of being true, of being real. Tolkien took great pains to create a verisimilitude of culture, of language, of geography, and yes, of race. The migration of peoples, the exchange of cultures, either voluntarily or by force, all of that is implied in a person's race, in the color of their skin, in relation to what spot of dirt they happen to occupy on the planet. Lord of the Rings isn't just a story predicated on the simple inclusion of elves, dwarves, hobbits, and men, but the delineation between them. Each is their own singular culture, so that it's a significant occurrence when they interact with one another. It makes it all the more significant when the armies of elves join with the armies of dwarves, or when a man weds an elf, or when men, elves, dwarves, and hobbits all join together in fellowship. Likewise, it should be of similar significance. It should demand similar explanation when the demographics of a world informed by medieval England more resemble that of present-day New York. What would art be like then if we took these people at their word? If the ethos of, oh my god bro, you can believe in wizards and dwarfs but not black people, were taken at face value? Luckily, there's a handy meme for just such an occasion. If Aragorn is black, why not make Frodo trans? Why not, as this commentator suggests, make the Númenóreans striped and polka-dotted? This person claims that skin color has no bearing on the plot, as if the simple mechanics of the plot are all there is, as if humans aren't visual creatures and aesthetics don't inform the story. If, in some hypothetical adaptation of Lord of the Rings, be it a card game or a movie or whatever, there really were polka-dotted Númenóreans, it would be bound to raise some questions. Taken at face value, this interpretation of art as mood swing, as unadulterated whimsy, is the same mindset of a child smearing paint all over a canvas until it turns a muddy brown. All these arguments I'm trying to make are of course moot to anyone for whom they might be politically antagonistic. I have to reiterate that these are people who, by and large, don't mean anything they say. They don't value Tolkien except as a sort of culture war game piece. In their world, the utility of art as consensus-forming mechanism trumps any sort of artistic integrity or intent. This is of course why, for all their talk of empowerment and standing up against white supremacy, that the champions of Black Aragorn content themselves with a race-swapped version of a canonically white character rather than creating or consuming anything new. There's little power, little self-esteem to be garnered from anything new. Something new takes time, takes risk. It's much easier to glom onto something people already recognize and which has a ready-made cultural significance. This brings us to the subject of representation. A Black Aragorn is created under the auspice of representation. I feel seen, they all say, some of them even breaking down in tears.
I've never seen myself represented in The Lord of the Rings before, so...
There's a lot to be said about the superficiality of embracing one's skin color as integral to one's identity. It also leads back to this sort of doublethink where Aragorn's race is claimed to have no bearing on anything whatsoever, while also being this great wellspring of self-esteem. If representation does bestow so much social and psychological capital, embraced with such unflinching self-interest, why should it be surprising then when a white person reacts with similar self-interest? In accepting the logic that a white Aragorn is somehow exclusionary to Black Lord of the Rings fans, that it somehow hinders their enjoyment, wouldn't it then follow that a Black Aragorn is somehow exclusionary or less enjoyable to white Lord of the Rings fans? Unless, of course, that's the point. The whole thing relies on a willful suspension of logic. If you think too much about it, you're a bigot. I'll wrap things up here by quickly tackling some other low-hanging fruit, some other arguments people make that are either too dumb or too uninteresting to talk too much about. But the Tolkien estate approved it. The Tolkien estate isn't Tolkien. It's no coincidence that once Christopher Tolkien died, the floodgate on licensing opened wide. But this sentence describes Aragorn as dark. Dark meaning dark in mood or bearing, or dark-haired or clothed. I think it's kind of gross and annoying when people weaponize a writer's own artistic flourishes to try and lie and deceive people. But people have depicted Jesus as white. Okay, but are you saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing? Either you're for it or you're against it. Actually, medieval England and Norway were both very diverse, multicultural. No, they weren't. You're using the exception to try and redefine the norm. White people had to come from somewhere. They didn't just come from the moon. Anyway, that's all. Let me know what you think. Call me racist or argue about the lore or storytelling or whatever down in the comments. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.